This is my greatest privilege to open this distinguished panel first with the lecture by my friend Amos. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, the attack on America on September 11th was not simply about poverty versus wealth. Poverty versus wealth is one of the world's most horrible problems. But we will misdiagnose September 11th if we simply think that this was an attack from the poor on the rich. It is not just about the haves and the have-nots. If the case were as simple as that, you would rather expect the attack to come, say, from Africa, the poorest, and perhaps to be launched against Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, the oil-producing states, the richest. No. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a battle between fanatics who believe that the end, any end, justifies the means, all the means, and the rest of us who believe that life itself is an end, not a mean. It is a struggle between those who think that justice, whatever they would mean by the word justice, is more important than life, on the one hand, and those of us who think that life takes priority over many other values, convictions, or faiths. The present crisis in the world, in the Middle East, between Israel and Palestine, is not simply about the values of Islam, nor is it about the mentality of the Arabs, as some racists try to convince us. Not at all. It is about the ancient struggle between fanaticism and tolerance, between fanaticism and life. September 11th is not even about the question whether America is good or bad, whether capitalism is ugly or evident, whether globalization should stop or not. This is about the typical fanatic claim. If I think that something is bad, I kill it along with its neighbors. Fanaticism, ladies and gentlemen, is older than Islam, older than Christianity, older than Judaism, older than any state or any government or political system, older than any ideology or faith in the world. Fanaticism is, unfortunately, an ever-present component of human nature, an evil gene, if you wish to call it so. I maintain that people who blow up abortion clinics in America, or people who burn down mosques and synagogues in Europe, differ from bin Laden only in the scale, but not in the nature of their crimes. Personally, I think that my own childhood in Jerusalem, if I may get personal for a few moments, my own childhood in Jerusalem rendered me an expert in comparative fanaticism. Jerusalem of my childhood back in the 1940s was full of self-fashioned prophets, redeemers, and messiahs. Even today, every other Jerusalemite has his or her personal formula for instant salvation. Everyone says they came to Jerusalem, and I'm quoting a famous line from an old song, they came to Jerusalem to build it and to be rebuilt by it. In fact, many of them, Jews, Christians, Muslims, socialists, anarchists, world reformers, actually came to Jerusalem not so much to build it, not so much to be rebuilt by it, but rather to get crucified or to crucify others, or both. There is an established mental disorder, a recognized mental illness known as the Jerusalem syndrome. Certain people come to Jerusalem from all over the world. They inhale the wonderful lucid mountain air, and then they suddenly up and set fire to a mosque or to a church or to a synagogue. Or else they simply take off their clothes, climb on a rock and start prophesying. No one ever listens. No one. Even today, even in today's Jerusalem, every line for a bus is likely to spark and turn into a fiery street seminar with total strangers arguing passionately about politics, morality, strategy, history, identity, religion, and the real purpose of God. Participants of such street seminars, while arguing about political and theological good and evil, try nevertheless to elbow their way to the top of the line. Everyone screams, no one ever listens. Except for me, perhaps. I listen sometimes. That's how I earn my living. Yet I may confess to you, ladies and gentlemen, that as a child in Jerusalem, I was myself a bit of a brainwashed little fanatic all the way. Self-righteous, chauvinistic, deaf and blind to any narrative that differed from the then powerful, overwhelming Jewish Zionist narrative of the time. I was a stone-throwing kid, a Jewish intifada kid. In fact, the first words I ever learned to pronounce in English, except for yes and no, were the words British go home, which is what we Jewish kids in Jerusalem used to shout as we were throwing stones at the British patrols in Jerusalem. A few minutes ago, I've called myself, ladies and gentlemen, an expert on comparative fanaticism. This is no joke. If you ever hear of a school or a university starting a department of comparative fanaticism, I hereby apply for a teaching position. As a former Jerusalemite, as a recovered fanatic, I feel I am rather qualified for the job. And yes, perhaps, Avishai, perhaps it is time that every school, every university, conducts at least a couple of courses in comparative fanaticism, because it is everywhere, because it is all over us. And I do not mean just the obvious kinds of fanatics, those who live across the television screen from ourselves, those whom we watch from our chairs every night, shaking their fists at the cameras and screaming slogans. No, I have in mind the more homely type of fanatics. I have in mind the fanatics who live and operate close to every one of us and perhaps inside every one of us. Don't we know the anti-smokers who will burn you alive for lighting a cigarette in their vicinity? The vegetarians who will eat you alive for eating meat? The pacifists, some of my colleagues in the Israeli peace movement, who are willing to shoot me right through the head because I have a different strategy than theirs on how to obtain peace with the Palestinians. I'm not saying, of course, that anyone who raises his or her voice against anything is necessarily a fanatic. I am not suggesting that anyone who has strong opinions is a fanatic. Certainly not. I am saying that the seed of fanaticism always lies in the uncompromising righteousness, the plague of many centuries. Of course, there are various degrees of evil and various degrees of fanaticism. A militant environmentalist may be uncompromisingly and righteous, but he or she will cause very little harm, excuse me, he or she will cause very little harm compared, say, to an ethnic cleanser or a terrorist. Yet all fanatics have a spatial attraction, a spatial taste for kitsch. Very often the fanatic can only count up to one. Two is too big a figure and too complex a figure for him or for her. At the same time, you will find that very often fanatics are hopelessly sentimental. They often prefer feeling to thinking, and they have a particular fascination with their own death. They despise this world and feel eager to trade this world for heaven. Their heaven, however, is usually conceived like an everlasting happiness in the conclusion of bad movies. Conformity and uniformity, the urge to belong and the desire to make everyone else belong, may well be the most widely spread, yet not the most dangerous forms of fanaticism. Remember in that wonderful film, Monty Python's The Life of Brian, when Brian says to the big crowd of his would-be disciples, "You are all individuals," and the crowd shouts back, "We are all individuals," except one of them who says sheepishly in a small voice, "I'm not." But everyone angrily hushes him. Indeed, having said that conformity and uniformity are mild but widespread forms of fanaticism, I have to add that very often personality cult, idealization of political or religious leaders, the worship of glamorous individuals, may well be another widespread form of mild fanaticism. The 20th century seems to have excelled in both. Totalitarian regimes, deadly ideologies, aggressive chauvinism, violent forms of religious fundamentalism on the one hand, and the universal idolization of Madonna and Maradona on the other. Up to somewhere in the 19th century, somewhere around the middle of the 19th century, give or take, it varies from one country to another, from one continent to another, but roughly, up to somewhere in the 19th century, most people in most part of the world used to have at least three basic certainties. Where will I spend my life? What will I do for a living? And what will happen to me after I die? Almost everyone in the world, just 150 years ago or so, almost everyone in the world knew that they were going to spend their lives right where they were born or somewhere nearby, perhaps in the next village. Everyone knew they would do for a living exactly what their parents did for their living or something very similar. And everyone knew that if they behaved themselves, they would be transformed to a better world after they die. The 20th century had eroded, often destroyed, these and other simple certainties. I believe that the loss of those elemental certainties may have provided for the most heavily ideological half-century, followed by the most fiercely selfish, hedonistic, gadget-orientated second half-century. For the ideological movements of the first half, the mantra used to be, tomorrow will be a better day, let's make sacrifices today so that we bring tomorrow. Let's even impose sacrifices on other people today so that our children will inherit a paradise in the future. Somewhere around the middle of the 20th century, this notion was replaced by the notion of instant happiness. Not just the famous right to strive for happiness, but the actual widespread illusion that happiness is displayed on the shelves and that all you have to do is simply to make yourself rich enough to afford happiness with your wallet. The notion of happily ever after, the illusion of lasting happiness, is actually an oxymoron. Either plateau or climax. Everlasting happiness is no happiness at all, just like an everlasting orgasm is no orgasm at all. I think the essence of fanaticism lies in the desire to force other people to change. The common inclination to improve your neighbor, or to mend your spouse, or to engineer your child, or to straighten up your brother, rather than let them be. The fanatic is a most unselfish creature. The fanatic is a great altruist. Very often, the fanatic is more interested in you than in himself. He wants to save your soul. He wants to redeem you. He wants to liberate you from sin, from error, from smoking, from your faith, from your faithlessness. He wants to improve your eating habits or to cure you from your drinking or voting habits. The fanatic cares a great deal about you. And in any case, topographically speaking, falling on your neck and being at your throat is almost the same gesture. One way or another, the fanatic is more interested in you than in himself, for the very simple reason that the fanatic has a very little self, or no self at all. Mr. Bin Laden and his ilk do not simply hate the West. It's not that simple. Rather, I think they want to save your soul. They want to liberate you, us, from our awful values, from materialism, from pluralism, from democracy, from the freedom of speech, from women's liberation. All these, the Islamic fundamentalists maintain, are very, very bad for your health. To be sure, Bin Laden's immediate goal was not America. His immediate goal was to turn moderate, pragmatic Muslims into true believers, into his kind of Muslims. Islam, in Bin Laden's view, was weakened by American values. But to defend Islam, you must not just hit the West and hit it hard. No, you must eventually convert the West. Peace will prevail only when the world is converted not to Islam, but to the most fundamentalist and fierce and rigid form of Islam. It will be good for you. Bin Laden essentially loves you. September 11th was a labor of love. He did it for your own good, although you don't understand it, but he really did it for your own good. He wants to change you. He wants to redeem you. Very often, ladies and gentlemen, all of this begins inside the family. Fanaticism, I maintain, begins at home. It begins precisely with the very common urge to change a beloved kin for his or her own good. It begins with the urge to sacrifice oneself for the sake of a dearly beloved neighbor. It begins with the urge to tell a child of yours, you must become like me, not like your mother. Or you must not become like me. You must not become like your father. Or please become something very different from both of your parents. Or among married couples, you have to change. You have to see things my way, or else this marriage is not going to work. Very often it begins with the urge to live your life through someone else's life. To give yourself up in order to facilitate the next person's fulfillment or the next generation's well-being. Self-sacrifice, ladies and gentlemen, self-sacrifice very often involves inflicting dreadful guilt feelings upon the beneficiary, thus manipulating, even controlling him or her. If I had to choose between the two stereotype mothers in the famous Jewish joke, the mother who says to her kid, finish your breakfast or I'll kill you, or the one who says, finish your breakfast or I'll kill myself, I would probably choose the lesser of two evils. That is, rather not finish my breakfast and die than not finish my breakfast and be guilt-ridden for the rest of my life. Let us turn now to the gloomy role of fanatics and fanaticism in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, Israel and much of the Arab world. Excuse me. The Israeli-Palestinian clash is essentially not a civil war between two segments of the same population, or of the same people, or of the same culture. It is not an internal but an international conflict. Fortunately, I say. Fortunately, it is an international, not an internal conflict, as international conflicts are easier to resolve than internal conflicts, or religious wars, or class wars, or value wars. I said easier. I did not say easy. Essentially, the battle between Israeli Jews and the Palestinian Arabs is not a religious war, although the fanatics on both sides are trying very hard to turn it into a religious war. It is essentially no more than a territorial conflict over a painful question of whose land, over territory. Two nations have a very powerful claim over the same very small country, the size of New Jersey or Wales. And the Israeli Jews call it their home, we call it our home, because there is no other place in the world which we can call home. And the Palestinian Arabs call it their home because there is no other place in the world which they can call home. It's a clash between right and right. It's a clash between one very powerful claim and another no less powerful, no less convincing, no less rooted. It can be resolved in a fanatic way, fight it to the death, but it will be resolved, I believe, through a painful compromise, which will turn this country into two nation states, or as I often describe it,